Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back to MedTech Day at Techstars Startup Week Dayton 2020. I hope everyone had a delicious lunch, and we're going to jump right back into our 1 p.m. session. Don't tell me, show me, 12 months of MedTech deals. So every year, Startup Week features funders talking about what they like to see in a deal. This year, we're going to turn that around, and we have the most active regional funders tell us what MedTech deals they actually funded in the past 12 months and what it was about those deals that made them jump. So our panelists today are Faith Voinovich, Principal at Ohio Innovation Fund, Ben Pidgeon, Executive Director at Vision Tech Angels, and Roger Edwards, Vice President of the Dayton Development Coalition's Accelerant Venture Capital Fund. And then our moderator is Keely Preytower, partner at Kaiku Advisors. So with no further ado, Keely, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Audrey. Appreciate it. Welcome, guys, to our session of Don't Tell Me, Show Me. We're going to try to make this as exciting as investment conversations can possibly be. So I thought what I'd do is I'll give myself a brief intro, and then I'd like to kick it off with a round table to the folks that are on the panel, having them introduce themselves. I'd love for the panelists to also give some insight into their organization and really trying to give the audience a feel for the type of investments, the size, maybe the type of organizations you tend to invest in, whether it's pre-seed and seed or growth stage. So we'll do that, and then we're going to dive into some of the recent investments in the last 12 to 18 months. So to introduce myself, Keely Preytower with Kaiku Advisors. We are a healthcare advisory firm specializing in working with early stage to mid-stage growth companies, developing growth strategies as well as raising capital. A little bit of background on me. I started my career in the managed care payer space, working for Medicare and Medicaid programs, and through that built a real passion for wanting to help improve patient outcomes and patient quality, care quality. I've been fortunate in the last 7 to 8 years to work with companies on the other side of the table. So growth stage, healthcare technology, software and services organizations that are selling solutions back into payers, providers, and health systems. So I'm excited today because normally I'm sitting in front of investors begging for capital. I've done that in the past, and so always curious to hear from investors, whether it's VC or private equity, what is it that gets you guys interested? What are you looking for? So really, really excited to be having this conversation today. I've been sitting in some of the other startup sessions this week, and I know everyone's talking about 2020, so I'm not going to bore the group here, but I think there's 3 consistent themes just to think about as we talk about investment. COVID's probably the big one. But we also know that, secondly, there's some instability in the markets. And then third, unless you've been under a rock, we're in election year. An election year always impacts regulatory organizations. And if you're in a MedTech company or a healthcare technology firm that is selling into anything tied to CMS, Medicare, and Medicaid, there's obviously eyes on that as well. So let's kick off the roundtable, and here's what I'm looking for the panelists to maybe start with before we dig into the individual investments. So we know there's a lot of upheaval right now. I think what people want to hear, and folks that are looking to raise capital, what does 2020 look like from your organization's perspective? What does it look like in the last 3 quarters? From the investments you've made or investments you've heard about compared to previous years? Has it slowed down? Is it kind of the same? And then what does the end of 2020 look like? Meaning, is there money out there and are people looking to invest? And kind of the general theme of what this year looks like compared to previous years. I think that's the big one. And then, when you're giving a background on your organization, are you typically investing in early stage as a venture capital firm? Do you invest in growth? What are the average size of your investments? And then maybe the types of investments. Is it more software services, medical devices? I think just to give the audience a feel. So I'm going to pick, Ben, I'm going to pick you. I'm going to start with you and just pick on you. So if you want to get started with your overview.
Sure. Yeah. My name is Ben Pidgeon. I'm the executive director for Vision Tech Partners. We are the largest angel group in central Indiana with about 125 investors. We are set up not as a fund where you have a kind of a if somebody has a fund, they're managing maybe $5 million and have a hypothesis to get that $5 million into 10 different companies with potential dry powder to follow on with more funding. We are set up as a volunteer check writing network where the 125 investors have to listen to a pitch, indicate some level of interest, and then follow the presentation through a diligence process if there's enough interest from the investors on a first pass. And we tend to be opportunistic investors investing across the nation. I think it's anywhere. I mean, last year we did a deal in Seattle, we did a deal in Boston, and did a deal in Austin. So when I do say that we're kind of nationwide, it's a little bit of a sampling on what the activity is. We do life science, MedTech. We also do B2B SaaS, and we've been pulled into some hard tech, carbon fiber, resin, and non-destructive testing come to mind. So it's been a fun year, to say the least. I think the first half of the year I did one deal. That check size was $500,000, and then in the last 60 to 90 days, I put 8 deals together. And so,
wow.
If I had to reflect back on the first half of the year, I don't know necessarily that I would attribute that limited check writing solely due to coronavirus. We had a number of deals where diligence just fell through, and we determined the market size wasn't big enough, or the management team didn't have the expertise. So, we had to back out of a couple of deals that we had expressed interest in because they didn't fit the thesis, and the diligence wasn't panning out the way that we had hoped. But I think we're going to get into a little bit later on the MedTech stuff and kind of what we gravitate towards in terms of funding. But I would describe our activity because the way that we're set up as opportunistic investors.
And are your investors who are looking through the end of 2020, they're pretty bullish on being able to continue to invest at the end of the year?
It's always an unknown. I mean, I don't know how to answer that, quite frankly, because it depends on the deal flow. I think it's going to depend on what happens in the markets to a certain degree. I mean, there's going to be a number of investors that have capital. They move in and out of the markets, and the fluctuation and volatility might create opportunities for them to have higher liquidity over in a competing market. So I think to the MedTech and life science folks out there, I think you're competing with a more liquid market.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's a totally fair. So, to combat that, you might look at different strategies on valuation.
Interesting. And I want to come back to that because I think that's going to be a theme here today. Faith, would you like to go next with your organization?
Sure. Thanks, Keely. So thanks, Audrey, as well for the introduction. My name is Faith Voinovich. I'm a principal at Ohio Innovation Fund, and I focus mainly in on our MedTech and life sciences deals. To contrast what Ben was saying, we are a traditional VC fund. So we're about a $50 million fund, and we invest in Ohio for Ohio. So that can mean anything from licensing out of any of Ohio's universities or institutions, or the companies based here, or even strong ties here with a split workforce in Ohio with a small presence elsewhere. We invest kind of across the board in terms of industry. We're about split 50-50 with tech and medtech, though we define medtech very broadly to include biotech, biopharma, just generally life sciences, as well as medical devices. And then we're also active on the technology side with SaaS companies, cybersecurity, data science, and the like. So as we're looking to make initial investments, we invest at the Series A level. So our initial check sizes are anywhere from a few $100,000 up to a few $1 million with reserves for follow-on. We look to be very active investors, and that includes taking board involvement at each of the companies that we invest in, usually as a board member, occasionally as a board observer. And on the medtech side, what that looks like, because I know Series A can be somewhat of a gray area in terms of how we define it, that usually looks for us of companies who have just received some sort of indication, an early indication for their medtech or med device side of things, or they're just about getting ready to go into their clinical trials in the FDA side when it comes to biotech or biopharma. So, of course, 2020 is going on. That had some impact. We have 20 companies in our fund right now. Had some impact early on. We were looking for some of our advanced manufacturing companies that had ties in with China and their supply chain issues. Since then, we've really seen those issues kind of work themselves out as the rest of the globe has kind of got up and running again. And luckily, with such a focus in healthcare and life sciences for our fund, a lot of our companies are actually making the best out of a really difficult situation and being able to provide great opportunities and really life-saving or life-helping resources for many people right now. In terms of deals, I think we'll touch on this a little bit later, but we have actually invested in 2 deals kind of during COVID time. One was on the early end where we completed the majority of diligence, been able to be in person. And then one we did almost fully, the diligence process, completely virtual in terms of talking with the lead investigators and everyone else. But we're excited about continuing to look into the market. Of course, difficult not to be able to meet in person. So much of what we do is based on relationships, but we're finding innovative ways to do that. Of course, on the Microsoft Teams today, on WebEx, on Zoom, and really getting to know our founders and their teams pretty well.
That's fantastic. And I think we should come back to that. It is weird doing due diligence without being able to meet the team, which I think is a big part of the investment. And how do you get a feel for them? And you can't exactly take them out to dinner and see what they're like outside of the pitch deck presentation. So that's got to really change the game.
Absolutely.
Fascinating. Okay, Roger, would you like to go next? Well, I guess you are the last one to go, so please go.
Absolutely. So by default, I'll go. It's nice to meet everyone. My name is Roger Edwards, and I oversee the Accelerant Fund. The Accelerant Fund is truly a fund. It's a little bit different than what Ben described earlier in his world. But to spend a minute on this, the Accelerant Fund is closely associated with the Dayton Development Coalition. It's the 4th fund. And our fund mix is a little different than traditional funds that you'll find when you go around and understand other angel funds and VC funds. Our fund is very heavily supported by the Dayton region. And what I mean by that is it's heavily supported by local institutions, not only a mix of large healthcare institutions, the hospitals, the payers, but it also all the educational institutions. We always joke that the Dayton region, can be summarized as the eds, meds, and feds when you think of the DNA of the region. And it really bears truth when you look to see who the primary investors of our fund are. We started the fund about 5 years ago, and the intention of this fund, it's the 4th fund, was to really drive sidecar and angel investment activity within the region and restart that. We've done a great job. We're currently, on average, when we invest, our average investment's probably between $250,000, maybe $400,000, but we're typically able to raise about 75 cents to $1 per every dollar we invest. So, we've been doing very well with that. So we've actually slowed our investment cycle down a bit. Our focus is, we're very agnostic as well in the opportunities we look at. We are open to looking to everything from MedTech, and our MedTech is, it's a broad definition as well. But when you look at our fund and just how it's come together, over 50% of our investments do involve healthcare and MedTech today. And it's just by the nature of the beast. That's what we've seen the most interesting investments for. When we do invest, we're very similar in nature. We will assume a board seat. We invest in a very standard model using convertible notes. So it's very applicable, and it allows us to work very closely with other funds in the region. One idiosyncrasy about our fund, though, is you've got on here, you've got basically a U.S. focus with Ben. You've got the Ohio Innovation, focus with a larger focus in Ohio. We are very focused within basically the footprint of the Dayton Development Coalition. It's around 14 counties locally. And if you think in terms of having a lot of institutional investors partnering their funds along with angel investors, our committee is very focused on looking for those key opportunities that will help drive employment and jobs within our region. So, while we do collaborate with, the other regions all around Ohio, et cetera, we typically are trying to tell the story about our investments. We're looking for the ones that, will have applicability back. And it could be someone actually headquartered somewhere else, but they're going to basically be manufacturing here, as a great example. It can be a lot of different scenarios, but that's a little bit of who we are. I look forward to some of the discussion we're going to have on this session. So,
great. Thank you, Roger. Okay, Ben, I think I'm going to pick on you again to start digging into the investments that the three of you folks have made in the last 12 to 18 months. And you and I were talking recently about one of your investments, Photonic Care, which I think is really exciting. And for me, when I look at investments and I look at startups, they've got to do good and do well. And it looks like this is really going to try to change the way that pediatrics and identifying ear infections in the middle ear is going to work. So can you dig into Photonic Care? And I think I'd love to know, how did you find this deal? How did it come to you guys? What stage is the company in when you invested, and where do you see the growth plan for them?
Yeah. So first of all, Photonic Care is a really interesting technology that allows you to get a ultrasound basically of the middle ear. And the ultrasound data will allow the caregiver insight as to whether there's an ear infection that will be treated with antibiotics, or if it won't be treated with antibiotics and the child needs to have tubes put in. One of the interesting elements of this technology is the number one reason why children are prescribed antibiotics is because of ear infections. And so when we did diligence on this deal, our first investment, I think, was 2017. And we did a follow-on recently, which is what I was talking about. But in 2017, we found out that the cycle to get to a point where a pediatrician's recommending an ENT visit is anywhere from 6 to 9 doses of antibiotics.
Wow.
And so the thought was, and still is, if we could get the child, if we know that antibiotics aren't going to work, then let's get to the ENT sooner. And it's been fascinating to watch that develop, because they've won every year. They're winning awards on innovation in their specific space. So Photonic Care came to us actually, I think, prior to my involvement with Vision Tech. They were in front of us in 2015, and at that time the technology was about the size of a copy machine. And the thesis was, we're going to sell these at $70,000 a piece to ENTs. And when we did some research within the ENT market at that time, my understanding was no ENT was going to pay that much money for it. It just didn't, the business unit economics didn't make sense. And so we invested in 2017, when they had continued to advance the technology. They were able to raise some non-dilutive funding. They got the technology down to the size of a large laptop, and had a kind of a business model that made sense, but it also needed a lot of honing in. They had been able to gather a CPT code, which is a reimbursement code that allows you to charge for the services. And they had to get some testing done through the FDA to get to a point where they were at today. And over the summer, they closed on a $5 million round and got another $2 million in non-dilutive funding. So they're off to the races. They've got some very, very large projections on revenue for 2021. And I think that the challenge with a lot of med tech that's out there is, how do you get this in once you're at the stage where the regulatory risk has been mitigated and the technological risk has been mitigated. It does what it does. It generates the data that you have, and you have a hunting license from the FDA. Can you get it in the hands of the physicians or clinicians that will be using that, and generate more data and sales off of that detail? So COVID is interesting. I don't think just because of COVID, pediatricians and clinicians didn't stop looking in ears, right? So I think that there's an argument that they're somewhat immune to the COVID situation, but that's not to say that there couldn't be issues with the supply chain in getting product. They still have to manufacture.
So I saw the grin on your face when you said they have very high revenue projections for 2021. And a lot of startups out there you've got to put a revenue plan together and revenue projections over the next 1 to 3 to 5 years. And oftentimes it's a little bit of a swag that you're throwing out there against the wall. I'm seeing everyone nodding. I'm assuming that's fairly common. You kind of know that the revenue projections, there's some math behind it, and there's a little bit of like, does this feel right? Is that pretty common with investments that you see? And as investors, have you guys found kind of a penchant to have a little bit of flexibility there?
Absolutely. I mean, I laugh because I think we could all go back to the days when we were in high school when we had to write a creative essay. And okay. so the graphs on revenue projections are always up and to the right, or up and to the left, depending on how you're looking at it. But
because investors won't invest if you don't have it in the right direction.
Right, exactly. And so like I think what we end up spending more time on when we do diligence and evaluating some of these companies is what's the belief, what needs to be believed around the ability of the management team's capacity to execute. Mm-hmm. Can they do what they say they're going to do? And you just keep on asking questions. You ask about milestones. You get to know them a little bit through Zoom, a lot through Zoom right now. I mean, that's how our diligence process looks. But yeah, it's an interesting time right now.
I don't know if Faith or Roger, anybody wants to tack in on that.
Yeah, what we work on with diligence is very similar to what Ben said. Rather than saying what do we need to believe about the team, we talk about what are your core assumptions. What are you using to figure these things out? What's your pricing structure? Does that make sense just on a sanity check level? The market you think you're going to be able to go into and enter, does that make sense on just a base level? We've had instances where everything looks pretty good and projections follow just about right along, but they're never exact. And particularly investing at the early stage, I think that's something that we all come to know. They will never be perfect. If they're perfect, then you need to go buy a lotto ticket because you're about the luckiest person in the world. But otherwise, I mean, it does get more important as you go to further along and in growth stage companies. You're able to narrow down those assumptions and say, based on what we know now and the success that our company or the challenges that we faced, we know now how to really dial into a better level so that you can get up and get more realistic. And we really just look for teams that know that, are able to put those initial assumptions together, and then are able to provide us updates on, hey, this was true, this is accurate, we're going to be right on there, or these things are kind of moving, and here's the reason why. If they're moving in a good way, that's great, let's keep doing it. And if they're moving kind of astray, then we need to roll back through and figure out what we need to do differently.
That makes sense. So one last question on this, and then I'll move on to Faith's investments. When you talk about doing remote due diligence, has the due diligence process slowed down for you guys and taken longer because you can't get in front of them face to face, or is it kind of around the same process?
I'll add it in from my standpoint. I think it's actually maybe speeding it up. I mean, we're able to get access to, we deal with a lot of different hospitals and physicians, et cetera. And, everybody's had to adjust to this new virtual world. And, it's actually probably more on my side, Keely, speeding it up for us because it's easier to get people on a call. And I will tell you, it's hammering a lot of us from late evenings, et cetera, because it's a lot more convenient. But I think from my standpoint, it's making it easier.
Fascinating. Looks like everyone kind of agrees.
Those companies that we've been working with that really need to raise now and haven't been able to bring in non-dilutive funds or haven't had that support, they really have the incentive to get this done very quickly. And so we're able to meet that pace. What we are seeing that's slowing things down in certain regards is companies that have any ability to wait to raise who know the value of being able to meet in person, who want to be able to see how they weather through this and figure out what their next projections are going to look like or what their next capital raise needs to be. We're seeing them wait as long as possible to try and get past this period of time and then to be able to engage in more of a normal process. So they'll reach out via Zoom, they'll keep us in the loop on the milestones they're hitting and kind of socialize us to the deal, but they're very clear that they're looking to raise further on down the line when they can get back to kind of some semblance of normalcy.
Fascinating. Okay. Okay, so Faye, let's dig into some of your investments. I know you said you had 2 this year, but I think you've had quite a few in the last 12 to 18 months. The one I really wanted to dig into is ScriptDrop. And, you know, a bunch of questions here for you, but, and I'd love for you to give the audience an overview of ScriptDrop. But my main question is, when did this investment happen? Because it seems like it's perfect timing for a global pandemic where nobody wants to leave their house. So that's my first question, but maybe kick it off with giving everyone a ScriptDrop intro.
Absolutely. So when I was referencing some of our companies who are really making the best of a difficult situation here, ScriptDrop is absolutely one of those. We had originally come across the company back in 2017. They were based in Nashville, Tennessee. It was a little bit outside of our scope at the time. Our fund was just founded by Bill Baumel, our managing director. He'd been out in Silicon Valley for about 20 years, a dozen plus successful exits, came back to the Midwest to try and build something here. So with that strong mission and purpose to invest in Ohio for Ohio, we said, you know, looks really interesting. Let's take a pause. We'll stay up to date. But we just re-engaged with them after they moved to Columbus, kind of late in 2019. So as we were first going through the diligence process, everything was in person. Their offices are about 10 minutes down the road from us. Got to know their team really well, excited about what they were doing, kind of what their ramp plans were. A lot of their assumptions made a lot of sense. It was just a matter of how quickly are they going to be able to get there. And as those conversations continued, we started hearing the initial rumblings of, okay, what's going on elsewhere in the world with COVID? How is that going to impact us here? Is that going to be happening here? And our first investment was actually in March, just kind of right before, but as we were starting to see things kind of heating up in the United States, into ScriptDrop. So ScriptDrop is a prescription delivery platform. They manage the healthcare system all the way through for patients, and really what they're dedicated to is increasing access to medication. There's a huge issue with medical non-adherence and medication abandonment in the United States. They're able to really easily fit into that gap. This was a problem pre-COVID, but it's only gotten worse with people feeling scared to leave their house, not wanting to go to pharmacies and wait in those lines with other people who have different ailments. So ScriptDrop has been able to scale and ramp very quickly. And that included, originally they'd worked through with the pharmacists. So everything would go through the system as usual, and then a pharmacist could click a button that said, hey, we'd like to go and deliver with ScriptDrop. Now what they're able to do is take a 2-year planned development timeline to go and offer a patient offering. They moved all of that and accelerated it into 2 months. Wow. So they were able to have text and code where patients were able to request that themselves, which not only helped with access and getting patients what they needed, but also as ScriptDrop was scaling across the United States and building new relationships. So not only are they partnered with thousands of independent pharmacies, but they also are partnered with some of the largest chains, Rite Aid, Kroger, Publix, Albertsons, across the U.S. and really working to build out their goal of serving 1 billion patients. So this all kind of came together at a great time. We're really excited about what they're doing, and we actually co-led this past round, which was their Series A with Cardinal Health, also here in town.
That makes a lot of sense. And I would imagine their growth strategy that was tied to their capital strategy, having been developed well before COVID was even on the radar, has probably changed quite a bit. And they're probably, I would assume, because they've got to ramp so quickly, they're burning through much of that cash to catch up. So are they thinking about raising more capital much sooner than they would have for a Series B because of the significant growth?
Absolutely. So as they were going through with their capital raise planning, really it was based on the milestones that will be at a certain level of ramp. Because they've accelerated so much of that ramping into this year, they're looking at raising much earlier than they were going to, but they've also identified some great strategic partnerships to work with and partners to go through that process so that they are continuing on not only the goals of their business, but also being able to add that capital influx. So it serves a sort of dual purpose as they continue to grow.
Very cool. And I know you also invest in more of the biotech type of organizations, and there was another company that we've been talking about called Clarimedics. Is that right? Clarimedics.
Clarimedics, you got it.
Yeah, could you touch on that one for a little bit?
Yeah, so Clarimedics is in the biotech space. They are developing a therapeutic that works on some of the worst bacteria. As many of us know, there's bacterial resistance, which is a growing problem, and antibiotics are not as effective as they have been on certain bacteria. One of the reasons for that is that bacteria will form something called a biofilm around them. And basically, it's a protective layer that prevents the antibiotics from getting to the bacteria to get rid of the infection. What Clarimedics is developing, and we're really excited about, is a therapeutic that actually breaks down that bacterial biofilm. So some of these antibiotics that are no longer effective on some of the worst bacteria might have a fighting chance of being effective there. But also in your more average cases, you're able to dose a lot lower on the antibiotics to preserve the amount of time that they're effective on the bacteria that we're able to serve today. So they're a spin out of Nationwide Children's Hospital. We had one meeting with them before everything was sort of shut down. And then the rest of our process was completely virtual in terms of meeting with the investigators there. Nationwide Children's Hospital was one of the strongest in terms of the lockdown, not going anywhere for the sake of protecting their patients. So the labs were closed down, everything else, but they raised a successful round. This was their seed. So we do about one seed deal a year. This was their seed round. And so we were able to close on that and continue through. And they have pretty exciting non-dilutive opportunities that are not announced yet, but are in the span of, a couple tens of millions of dollars. Them and another one of our companies, Inversa, are both on that path. And what's been exciting is, though the government has had a huge focus on items that are dealing with COVID, the nice thing is that Clarimedics, as many of you might know, it's not necessarily the virus that is what's hugely deadly in the patient population. It's a lot of those secondary infections and the bacterial infections. And though Clarimedics won't be ready for kind of this round of COVID, we're really hopeful that to the extent this ever happens again, of course, God forbidding, that they're able to step in and to be really effective in making sure that that death rate can be a lot lower.
Well, and who knows how long COVID is going to stick around. So they might be really well positioned in 2021 or 2022 for this. Okay. All right, Roger, it's time for me to pick on you. So I'm gonna throw a couple questions at you first and then get into a recent MedTech investment.
Okay.
And specifically because you are very Dayton focused, and the majority of your investors are institutional investors with a very heavy focus in healthcare, whether it's health plans and payers or the health systems here. So knowing that, what are the primary types of investments that you look for or that your committee is looking for? And what are some of the key tenets that your investment committee follows when improving those investments?
Yeah, I think, well, like I said earlier, we're primarily looking for those that will have some sort of a footprint with the region. There has to be a story to it. And we like to tie that to jobs, employment, future growth, projections, et cetera. But, we walk and talk a lot like the other angel funds. Some of the basic tenets we try to follow, and I will be the first to tell you, because I think I know one of the companies you're going to ask about is, I'll explain one that we broke the rules on. But our basic tenets is we don't go alone. We're a smaller fund. We have to have collaborative partners that we're investing with. All of your mature investors out there will be the first to tell you that investing is not a competitive game. It's a collaborative game. And, that's pretty much what we're, staged with. We typically are also, and we've seen an evolution here in the last few years, but, we are primarily more seed, even becoming Series A stage. We're looking for those investments that, there were some great comments earlier about the management team, et cetera, but we're looking for those investments that, the story is pretty much being told by people that are either very, very competent or they've shown they've done it before, And those are coming from, we're seeing just neat things from the standpoint of we're seeing orthopedic physicians being heavily involved, right from the start. But we're seeing basically very mature management teams are coming out of the woodworks with some very, very competitive solutions. And when you play in the med tech space, It's especially if there is an FDA component to this. Those are substantial and they're complex investments. So, I think all of us are looking for those very comprehensive stories, comprehensive management team, and solid leadership from the start. More than I think that it was started when I first started with the fund. That was not truly the story. We were looking for some of the blueprint drawings and, getting excited together about what could happen. Those are pretty much, it's a competitive landscape right now for the investment dollars we have. So.
Okay. And how important is your proximity to the Air Force and the Air Force Research Lab? And what are you seeing from an investment perspective with collaborations between investors and like the SBIR grants and the AFRL?
It's really skyrocketing, and it started a few years ago. But we joke about there's inside and outside defense, but the inside defense, the Department of Defense, is throwing a lot outside defense, and they're looking for somebody to catch it.
Yeah.
We're extremely involved with current programs that the Department of Defense is sponsoring through Wright-Patterson Air Force Base and others, but they have their entrepreneurs out pitching for SBIR dollars, which basically that's Small Business Innovation Research grants through the government. And we have attended some of those professional pitches that are done, and as investors, it's interesting to see their world. They're very technical pitches, they're driven, and they're driven for a purpose, and there are significant checks written for those companies pursuing those dollars. The Department of Defense has an initiative that they are driving nowadays, and we're very tied in with it through the Air Force in regards to educating those entrepreneurs, in regards to pitching for angel and venture capital around and mirroring that with SBIR dollars. That sounds extremely easy, but these are two different worlds colliding, that are coming together. We started something, and we've had tremendous support from other local funds, and we've even partnered with some funds that are actually on a national level at this point. But we did our first in August training event for entrepreneurs coming out of the government for the United States. We based it here in the Southwest Ohio corridor, and it was a tremendous event. We had, I think, over 300 and some attendees attend, and we basically were teaching them the basics of, investment capital and what it consists of. Follow on to that, we're actually holding a lot of basically follow-on meetings, mentoring events now with the entrepreneurs that are interested. So to answer your point, there's a tremendous focus with the Air Force, but it's a world that's different than ours, and we're trying to figure out how we even relate together. So
yeah, fascinating. And I want to come back to one of the points you said in a minute. And I know we have 7 minutes left, so we're going to keep going. Can you just go through a recent MedTech investment that your fund has had, Roger, and then we'll kind of open it up to the broader group?
Sure, I'll make this extremely short. It's actually a follow-on that we're doing this year, but I would highlight a company called AMB Surgical, which is a great example. For individuals that know anything about scoliosis children, it's a horrible disease those children go through. They're facing multiple surgical procedures for the spinal implant that causes the adjustments to be performed. And we latched onto one of these in the Dayton region a few years ago. And a local orthopedic surgeon is involved through one of our pediatric hospitals, et cetera. But this is one that we actually, like I said earlier, broke the rules on. We went alone. And we've been alone for a little while this has been incubating. But we believe the founders actually, had the formation of an executive leadership team. And they did a phenomenal job, partnered with Ohio State University, of perfecting the technology, proving that it could be done through a prototype. And now they're actually taking it to the next stage, to where what I look for is they've actually identified a strategic relationship. It's coming off the West Coast, and it's a group that is very well tied in with a much more extensive network from an investment as well as, from a end consumer standpoint to be able to take this to market. So, they've kind of met all the thresholds that we've been looking for. And, it's kind of just progressing. But if you want to do any research on that, the competitive technology we're up against, there's only one competitor out in the market. And that's what makes this so interesting from my standpoint. But NuVasive bought a company called Ellipse several years ago. And I think the acquisition price was probably around $380 million last time I looked. So,
wow.
That's our competitor that we're, building up here in Dayton, Ohio to take on. So
that's awesome.
Yep.
Thank you. So we've got 5 minutes. I'm checking the Q&A log, but I also have a couple other questions based on some things that you folks have brought up. Roger, you mentioned working with folks coming out of the AFRL, and I've seen this a lot. It's having a great idea is part of it, but if you can't tell the story and get the value across, you really have nothing. So the question for the broader group is, as you're doing due diligence and looking to invest with an organization, you've got the team and then you've got the technology. How important are both of those together? How important is the team in making that decision to make the investment? And then maybe I'll pick on you to start.
Sure. Yeah, I'd say the team is the most important. Typically, when we do diligence and kind of jump in on some of this, a lot of our investors look for the management, the market size, and the current status of the product. And then a second degree of the management team is that we typically like to see a hipster, a hacker, and a hustler.
Hustler. Okay.
so hipster is the idea guy or gal. The hacker is your tech person, and your hustler is your salesperson. And so the management team is really important because it's pretty rare that you have one person that wears all three of those hats and excels in all three of those categories. So just due to I could go into a little bit more, but I think due to time, I want to give a chance to others.
Sure. Thank you. Dave?
Yeah, I mean, team is huge. Probably it's a little bit less important to us in the more techy MedTech side of things, just because a lot has to do with intellectual property that you have, kind of your pathway through the FDA, what sort of approvals, but that doesn't mean that it's not something we look at. And what we really try and assess early on is whether people are self-reflective and know what their strengths are and are willing to absolutely go and do what they do best, but also recognize where some of those areas for growth are and make sure that they're willing to and excited to bring on people to the team that can supplement some of those areas and know that that's what's best for the company. And every once in a while we get into difficult situations, right? If you're not necessarily the perfect person to be doing the sales role, where do we move you as a co-founder? Are you kind of more a visionary person? If you're a really techie person, maybe you're not the CEO, but you move over to the CTO and you really have a lot of impact that's there. And so we don't start having those conversations right at the very beginning, but we like to see that there's an understanding of doing what's best for the company and really building out teams where everybody is being utilized in their highest and best way.
Awesome. Fantastic. And I think, Raj, you kind of already hit on that with your experience with the AFRL and the techie guys. I love that. What was it? The hipster, the hacker, and the hustler.
Yeah,
I'm going to use that. I love that.
Yeah, we're going to steal that over here, Ben.
Yeah. So I think we've got a minute left. I don't see any questions on here. And Audrey, I don't know if I'm doing this wrong. Leave it to the MedTech facilitator not to know how to use technology. But
I haven't seen any either, so you're good.
All right. Well, I know we had other questions lined up, but really appreciate everyone's time today. Excited to hear that there are dollars out there for investment in 2020. And that you all are looking to continue to invest those funds. And hopefully the folks on the phone today got some insight into how to position their pitch to investors, whether it's angel investors or funds. So thank you guys so much. We appreciate it.
Great.
Thank you all, and thank you, Keely, for being our moderator today. I enjoyed the session. I enjoyed hearing about some of the startups that are coming up and starting to grow. So thank you all. Attendees, hang around with us. We got a couple more sessions on our MedTech Day. Coming up next at 2 o'clock, begin with the end in mind, which I've heard a few panelists say today. So if you've been watching along, I'm sure you've heard it too. So we're taking that to heart, and we've got a panel with some folks who have merger and acquisition records and can speak to how those exit deals happen. So we hope to see you back here at 2. Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.